I'd like to welcome Michael Volgger, who worked for a couple of years as a senior researcher at Eurac Research and now full professor at the School of Management and Marketing at Curtin University in Perth, Western Australia, and discipline lead for tourism, hospitality, and events. Michael, we are proud to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Harald. Thank you, Roland, Anke, Wolfgang, and Gerhard. I should say thank you also for yesterday. It was beautiful. Thank you for the invitation, also to the Eurac team at the back. Of course, it is an honor and a great pleasure to be here at this workshop. It has been very intellectually stimulating, I must say, but it's also a great pleasure for me to be here in my first home and be able to speak about my second home, which is Australia, or more specifically, Western Australia. So I will try to take you on a brief stroll through Australia, Western Australia, to try to investigate a little bit the link between heritage and innovation in this particular country. I will highlight a few things, a few phenomena, but please don't expect a fully cohesive picture, but I will try to make some sense of what we see. When I first moved to Australia, I read a book on the state's history, or I should say to Western Australia, and I read a book on the state's history since British settlement in 1826. And the book is titled A Land of Vision and Mirage, so a land of vision and illusion. And the author, the Western Australian late historian Geoffrey Bolton, he wrote, beginning with the first governor, Captain James Stirling, bold entrepreneurs have pushed projects for investment and development on the basis of inadequate research and over-hopeful assessment. Caution has been pushed aside as inexperienced settlers were urged into the role of pioneers. So this thinking, this thought of pioneering, of the pioneering agriculturalist, of the pioneering pastoralist who pushes more and more into the hinterland, into more environmentally challenging area, but always very scenic areas, of course. That has been a key element, if not the key element, of the Australian identity and storytelling and legend until today. And you find it in many songs and his stories. One example amongst many of this adventurism is on the slide. In the 1980s, there was an increasing concern about the long-term drinking water supply of the state's capital, Perth, in the southwest of the state. And for some, the most obvious solution to this drinking water problem was to build a pipeline or open canal more than 2,000 kilometers long from the north of the state, where there is, or where there can be, quite strong summer rainfall. You can see that parts of this European settler mentality, they felt that this rain up there in the wilderness in the north, that's a waste. So let's bring it down. This project didn't go ahead. It was very close to going ahead. But it shows a bit the mindset of making a foreign land useful by intervention, also with a certain disregard for risks or for specific local conditions. There's another incident, more recent one, which I'm sure you have heard about as it went through the global media, not only the local one. And I think this pastoralist idea of conquering and pioneering a little bit shines through this one as well. On the 24th of May 2020, so fairly recently, the mining firm Rio Tinto, they blew up these old rock shelters or caves in an area which is called Yukon Gorge in the northern Western Australian Pilbara region as part of an iron ore exploration project. Iron ore is, of course, the most important export commodity of Australia. This happened despite the archaeologists. It was well known that this site is one of the most significant archaeological sites in Australia. It is the only site showing continuous human, or has evidence of continuous human settlement and activity, which goes back to almost 50,000 years. Most of the other sites are on the ocean. But the area also had more than 8 million tons of high-grade iron ore, and so which with a value of more than 100 million euro. So Rio Tinto went ahead, and to be fair to them, their activities had been approved by the Western Australian state government based on an existing law a few years earlier. So there has been a lot of outcry, there have been consequences, the chairman had to leave, and all sorts of stuff. But the unfolding of this shows that there is still this struggle between, on the one hand, this attempt to have this contemporary economic development, and on the other hand, how we deal with heritage, and in particular, indigenous heritage. And in general, I would say, in these conflicts, the development ethos prevails in Australia in general, in particular far away from the population centers. I took a look at the Australian National Heritage Strategy in this context, and I found it quite interesting. I observed two things there, and maybe for UNESCO people this is nothing new, but my first observation was that Australian heritage is clearly requested to prove a contribution. And when I say contribution, I mean a financial contribution. The strategy is full of dollar figures and jobs created by particular sites. So it's not like that the aesthetic, social, cultural, scientific importance is stressed, but clearly the financial worth trumps these elements. And the second observation is that the approach to heritage is very much list-based, inventory-based. So I quote from the strategy, Australia's heritage is truly diverse. Some sites are on the World Heritage List, some sites are on the National Heritage List, other sites are lesser known and are recognized in regional lists. I need to smile. So it's list, and that's diversity. Now, those things that are listed are heritage, but I would also say vice versa. In order to be heritage, you need to be listed, which means there is a clear focus on icons, whereas the everyday context, the streetscape, the houses of the everyday population, they probably are not framed in terms of heritage, which for me as a cultural anthropologist by training is interesting, at least. I think it also leads to a lack of focus on the ensembles, like the streetscape, the atmosphere, but even on the intangible aspect, as I will try to highlight a little bit more. From a Western point of view, as you know, Australia is a young country. British settlers started arriving 240 years ago. And for someone with a European view on this, you would be tempted to say there's little cultural heritage. But of course, there are 65,000 years plus of Aboriginal heritage, and while this has been long neglected, too long, there has been a recent push in that, and more and more museums are built with showing craft and artifacts and art and so on. But what happens to the intangible heritage there? So what happens to the languages, for example? I once discussed with an Aboriginal tourism guide, actually probably the leader of Aboriginal tourism in Australia. He said, Michael, you need to understand, Australia is like Europe. There's huge diversity of groups and languages, yet the Westerners have a tendency to treat it as one. They lack a sense and the respect for this diversity. In fact, there used to be 250 distinct languages spoken in Australia before the British settlers arrived. Nowadays, only half of them survive, and 90% are highly endangered, and only 12 languages have sufficient number of speakers so that they can be considered relatively safe. So it's 5 to 12 here. But there's really not a lot of discussion on this in Australia at all. There's some dual naming happening, so Aboriginal names, Western English names in parallel. There is some timid attempts to teach languages at school, but it's difficult because of lack of speakers and hence lack of teachers as well. and some Aboriginal initiatives to keep the languages alive. But in general, there's remarkably little attention compared to the massive extent of heritage that is being lost right in front of our eyes. And coming from a minority region here, that to me is pretty shocking. So moving to the cities, which Australia is one of the most urbanized countries in the world. So this clash between development and heritage has, of course, also been happening in the main population centers, and often with development having the upper hand. So these photos here from Perth, Western Australia's capital city. There was a first population boom when gold was discovered at the end of the 19th century. A lot of houses were built and people came. And you see how it looked like on the left-hand side. There was a second mining boom in the 1960s, 1970s. Again, a lot of wealth into the city, a lot of people. But what happens, the old houses were essentially all demolished. They were modernized in a way so that this gold rush architecture was removed by new high-rise developments. And it's another view on the city here from the river. You see how it looked in 1935, and same place in 2019, full of high-rise. In contrast, very nearby, there is the coastal town of Fremantle. And interestingly enough, there, the historic building stock has been retained. And if we look at this, again, at these time-lapse photos, you see that the streetscapes are pretty much intact as they were 100 years ago. So the question is why? There is clearly a context where development and building new is favored, but why has it been done differently here? And the quick and simplifying answer is because of tourism. Or more specifically, because of an event, the America's Cup, hosted in 1986 in Fremantle, which changed the identity of the city from an industrial town, from a harbor town with a decaying building stock into a heritage-preserving tourism town. For those who don't know, the America's Cup is the oldest sailing trophy in the world, and it's often presented as the oldest sports competition in the world. And in 1983, the Australian yacht was called Australia 2 from the Royal Perth Yacht Club. They won the cup, beating the US Americans after 132 years for the first time. And so the cup came to Fremantle because the winner has the right to host it, and that happened 4 years later in 1986 and 7. So this triggered this complete transformation of the city. A lot of investment, a lot of money were poured into the city. But different to other situations, this did not result in a replacement of the old, but a development was triggered where innovation was paired with heritage conservation. And it was more a style of repair, maybe reconversion of some industrial buildings and restoration. And I think the external perspective was really crucial in that. So tourists showing the locals that this is actually pretty, what you have. So it's worth conserving. And of course, in the Australian context, the tourism helped also to put a dollar figure behind the conservation. So there was an economic justification why this makes sense. So what I'm trying to do is here, I'm trying to paint a picture where in Australia in general, there's clearly a pro-development bias. But with insert tourism into this, then it clearly appears that tourism is an ally of some sort of conservation, or at least a middle course between the two. Tourism is also an ally today of Aboriginal heritage recognition, as are some designations such as national parks, which are designed for natural heritage, but have become the main tool, or a very important tool, to protect cultural heritage as well. So here, this is the largest river in Western Australia, Fitzroy River, in Indigenous language, Martuwarra, and you see the dual naming. That was the river which they wanted to pump the water from to Perth 25 years ago, but there's also a lot of local pressure from irrigation farming, cotton farming. The local indigenous people, they don't want to touch the river water for spiritual reasons, for cultural reasons, for natural, ecological reasons. And with the help of tourism, which allowed them to offer an alternative economic development trajectory, they could enhance their negotiation power. And so far, they prevailed in negotiation with these big agricultural entrepreneurs, which is quite remarkable. So in a sense, the Aboriginal tourism helped greatly here. It's also become one of the most innovative parts of tourism in the country. And it's also been helping to raise awareness for Aboriginal heritage amongst Australians, because most of the tourists are domestic tourists. And for the first time, some of them for the first time, they see why these things should actually be protected. I moved back to Perth, to the beaches there, and we stay with the beaches from now on. So you see on the slide an exception. It's the only high-rise hotel building on any of the Perth, or in fact, Western Australian beaches. The controversial entrepreneur Alan Bond, in mid of the 1980s, he was able to build this so-called Observation City Hotel, despite an emerging understanding, collective understanding, that there should be no high-rise developments on the Indian Ocean beaches, and the dunes and the beaches should be protected from any sort of development. It has remained an exception until today, and I think it illustrates that there is an emerging sense in Australia for the beach life being some sort of an intangible heritage. It's of course not listed, it's not named as such, it's not labeled as such, but I think this is something that can be observed. That leisure, the particular Australian way of doing leisure, has become a central element of what people perceive as intangible heritage. Another leading local entrepreneur, Andrew Forrest, he has got more money than some countries in the world, more recently tried to revamp this so-called Indiana tea house on the Perth beach of Cottesloe and try to transform it into a boutique hotel. He has not succeeded, and he has been denied approval despite 5 years of discussion, architecture competition, and change proposal. Interestingly, in the middle of this process, the building became heritage listed in 2021, which is interesting to me as it is a fairly recent building. It was only built in 1996, although it was modeled after its predecessors, in particular one of the previous buildings, the Centenary Bathing Pavilion, built in 1929. So this recent building has this fake mock heritage facade, which tries to replicate this old colonial architectural style. However, it turned into an icon, a local icon, tourism icon, also due to social media, with Taylor Swift posting it and others as well. If you nowadays Google Perth, you find this one comes up as one of the most visible icons. And actually, and I'm not sure how common this is, as a justification for the heritage listing, the recognition as a landmark by tourists was mentioned. So it says because the tourists perceive it as a landmark, it should be listed on one of these famous heritage lists. Anyway, the entrepreneur, Andrew Forrest, he undertook an architecture competition for this site in 2019. You see which proposal won on the left-hand side. All participating architects suggested replacing the existing building. But in a public consultation, only 10% of the locals supported that. They actually showed a strong support for retaining the existing facade. So Andrew Forrest went back to the drawing table and he came up with a new proposal which retained the facade of the current building. That's on the right-hand side here. Now, after almost 3 years debate in the local government, this proposal was also rejected because of, I quote, lack of community benefit. While now the aesthetics seemed fine, he retained the old facade. He tried to combine the old with the new. He tried to be respectful of the heritage element, heritage in an Australian sense. Now the function was questioned. He said, the mayor noted he wrote or said in an interview, so this entrepreneur wants to build a hotel, but commercialization and privatization of beaches are not part of Australia's culture. That's interesting, I think, isn't it? While the proposal tried very hard and demonstrated a sense for the built heritage, it tried to be aesthetically respectful, to combine the old with the new. It still failed to advance because it failed to recognize this emerging Australian way of leisure, which of course is a problem for tourism, because the beach is sacred. And so often there is conflict with a tourism proposal. And I show another example, 1,200 kilometers north of Perth. Even there, this proposal was not allowed to go ahead. In the middle of the World Heritage Site, Ningaloo Reef, a beautiful area, there was an idea of building a Coral Coast resort. But again, there is an Australian sense of how tourism should be done, and this has more to do with camping-style tourism. And so locals in Perth, 1,200 kilometers away, campaigned heavily against this resort development. Yes, because of ecological considerations, but I would say, and others have said before me, it was also a case of domestic tourists against tourism development, against a particular type of tourism development. So once again, a type of tourism development, leisure development that was not in line with this emerging sense of Australian way of life and leisure were confronted with fierce opposition. And this despite we have this pro-growth atmosphere in general. And despite we have all the mines and huge agricultural projects, which are, you can objectively say, are much more destructive than any of these relatively small-scale tourism projects. Tourism innovation that did happen often was at the interface between innovation and heritage. So there's a lot of museum, actually they speak of a museum mania spreading across Australia, often cultural centers exhibiting Aboriginal heritage. And in a sense, it makes heritage more accessible. And the other major tourism intervention and innovation we are seeing is related to viewing platforms on spectacular natural places. So again, it could be seen as a way of making heritage more accessible, but also of channeling the flow. Like you design a place where this interaction between the heritage and the tourism takes place, and so you do it in a controlled manner in designated places. So overall, I would say actually in tourism in Australia, there is a strong attempt to combine heritage with innovation. I come to the conclusion. So what I try to show is that in general in Australia, in these conflicts between heritage protection on the one hand and development on the other, the development often comes out at the winning side, at the winning end. Within this context where a sense for heritage is really only just emerging, tourism has become the major ally of heritage protection and types of development which combine innovation with conservation. And I tell you, about half of the projects we do at the university are paid by environmental protection agencies, so tourism projects, because tourism is seen as the ally. We have the same goal, and which is related to this common asset of culture and nature. So tourism has been a front runner in this sense. And has combined, as I said, innovation with heritage protection, museums, viewing platforms, indigenous tourism, some timid attempts in agritourism, and so on. But at the same time, for tourism proposals to get public support, they have to pass a tough test. So there is a lot of public scrutiny on them, including they need to respect this Australian sense of heritage, which I think includes this emerging sense of the Australian way of doing tourism, of the Australian way of doing leisure, and of the Australian way of approaching the beach. And so, in conclusion, I think there is almost a double function of tourism here. On the one hand, it is an ally of heritage protection, and on the other hand, and its hypothesis, maybe it's becoming a sort of heritage in its own right. So an object of heritage. Okay, I leave it here. Thank you very much for the attention.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. It's always a kind of genuss to listen to you. Yeah? But about that later. Tourism has become the major ally of heritage development. But we were talking also about authenticity and respect. So as far as I understand, especially with the case study of Fremantle, tourism is more to interpret as an economic factor. So let us make this city a touristic city because we can make money. And it's not because of the respect in confront to the old things, isn't it? Or is it too dramatic what I'm saying here?
I think so. I don't think it's that clear cut. No, I think there's a number of elements. The economic elements is crucial for the Australian mindset. It's a very pragmatic mindset, as you know very well, Harold. What makes money is good. So yes, tourism does make money. So yes, it is good in a sense. And tourism helps to put a very, very much needed economic rationale behind a rationale which is understood that heritage protection might make sense. And there are, of course, and have been in Fremantle historically, heritage protection groups, but they lack the political power. Once this tourism element came in, and plus the view from the outside, which also made the Australians proud, that people from the outside came and said, oh, this is actually very beautiful. So I think there has been this combination of factors which came together and ignited as an implementation of this protection. Yes.
So another hypothesis, if in Europe there would start a kind of movement to protect the old Aboriginal languages in Australia, Australians would start to think that this could become eventually an economic factor. Yeah? Only then they would start to preserve the languages.
Yeah, and once again, maybe an exaggeration, but I think there is some truth to that.
But thank you very much to you, because I guess only South Tyroleans can explain with their, let me say, cultural diversity based on languages. That's what you explained us with the problems of Aborigines in Australia. Is there any question?
I have one quick question.
In micro, Elena.
So thank you, first of all, for this interesting presentation. I'm really fascinated by the idea that we choose the type of tourists that we want. So tourists who will respect our beaches, who are respectful also of a mindset. And you were mentioning some bottom-up initiatives. So citizens, locals, not really from the beach, but from 150 kilometers, if I remember, campaigning against the resort. But I was wondering, it's more of a bottom-up, it's also a national policy, regional policy, it's more of a mindset in something structured. What is the scheme that is behind this?
No, it's completely bottom-up. Yeah, it's also not just 150 kilometers, it's more than 1,000 kilometers away. So it's pretty far, like, I don't know, we try to defend something in Hamburg, I don't know. So yes, it is bottom-up. And we should not forget, or I should say, that tourism in Australia is mainly domestic tourism, right? Australian international tourism is relatively tiny, it's much smaller than we might think. So it's mainly national tourism, and part of the Australian way of life, or this domestic tourism, this roaming freely the outback, is part of what an Australian thinks is an Australian life. So a lot of their life models contain an element of when I'm old, I will start traveling the country I sell off my house and I start traveling around. So this vast country of the bush, that's perceived of being part of our backyard almost, although it's 1,000 kilometers or even more away. And yes, this is bottom up. And they have been doing this for long, like this camping-style tourism, which conflicts with a resort-style tourism, which probably is more favored by international tourists, but not ingrained into the Australian identity. And this is where the local tourists campaign against the initiatives for international tourists.
Professor Luger yesterday was talking about half or semi-sacred places, the UNESCO place in South Tyrol. You were talking about the beaches of sacred places. It's really interesting. This is not a listed heritage, but it's so deeply inside the culture. Very, very important expression.
I think that's interesting from an Italian background as well, with the current discussions around, or an attempted intervention at the beaches and concessionari and so on. In Italy, the beaches having been privatized, or at least with a lease. This is unthinkable in the Australian context. So the beach is sacred, and translating that to South Tyrol, I mean, it's like the mountain. The mountain is sacred, or isn't it? Like, that's the question, I think, yeah.
Yeah, great. Final presentation, wonderful. Thank you very much again.